Ever since emulators became ubiquitous, or more specifically MAME, I've had something of a fascination with home computer arcade conversions. As a child I played plenty of these, but in so many cases I had no idea that I was actually playing an arcade conversion. So with that in mind, let us visit arcade conversions for the first time. I wanted this video to be relatively focused and not just another one of those free-form let's compare type videos, so I decided on a structure. I'm going to be comparing arcade conversions on what I consider to be the big 3 8-bit micros that were prevalent in the UK. The Commodore 64, the ZX Spectrum 48K, and the Amstrad CPC 464, and then scoring them on a few categories. First up, graphics. Not necessarily graphics as compared to the original, but how well they represent the visuals of the arcade game with respect to their own system limitations. The C64 is arguably always going to look more faithful than the Speccy, but how well did they tailor the conversion to the system? Secondly, sound, and again with respect to the system's limitations. The C64 probably has the advantage here, but let's try and look at it from what the system itself could do. Thirdly, we've got completeness. So how much did they include and how well did they represent it? In a racing game it might be how many tracks or vehicles were kept, or maybe how many levels in a platformer. Again, paying attention to what the system could be made to do. And lastly, playability. So how well does the game play when compared to the arcade original, and how well did the developers understand what made it fun to play? This is more of a level playing field, so it should produce some interesting results. Then at the end I'll tot up the points for each conversion and we'll see which is objectively best. Before I get into it though, I needed a way to pick the games in question, and as a self-professed C64 zealot it'd be way too easy for me to pick games that I know were streets ahead on the 64, so that's not going to work. So I went to my favourite non-evil search engine, I entered the phrase the best arcade games of all time, clicked the first result and then noted them all down. I landed on Techradar's list of the 50 greatest arcade games of all time, and so in the interest of impartiality I just stuck with it. Although I can't say I agree with the bulk of it, but that's kind of the whole point of this exercise, right? The games I'm looking for are original commercial releases that featured on all three of the original systems in question, so no expanded 1 to 8K versions, fan remakes, public domain releases or the like. Just original releases developed under license, or at least a close approximation, around the time of the arcade cabinet's release. Many arcade conversions, especially on the C64, had multiple versions, typically separated for Europe and the US, so in these cases I just chose whichever came first. So here you go, here's what's left after all those criteria were met. There's 18 games on this list to check out, and I'm going to start from the bottom of the list and work upwards. This is going to be part 1 of maybe 3 or 4, so I can do them justice without glossing over the scoring. So anyway, enough babbling from me, let's get to the games. So first on the list we've got Track and Field, released to the arcades by Konami in 1983, and it needs no introduction really. It's not the first sports game by any stretch, but I'm pretty sure it's the first athletics game and certainly the first multi-event sports game. There are 6 disciplines in all: the 100 metres, the long jump, the javelin, the hammer, the 100 metre hurdles, and then the high jump. Speed is achieved by quickly alternating 2 buttons as fast as possible and then jumping with a 3rd button. The hammer and the high jump automatically speed you up, so you're just concentrating on timing the action button during those ones. There's a couple of features I'd like to see in the home versions that polish this game up quite nicely though. The first is the nice parallax scrolling of the advertising hoardings in the crowd that gives you a sense of speed. There's the guy who comes out to measure your long jump distance, and then there's the character reactions after you succeed or fail an event. This should be an interesting one since the home computer versions were released a few years apart, so I don't think there'll be much consistency, but let's see. So I decided I'll just go in alphabetical order, and that means the Amstrad CPC is up first, and this bare bones title screen doesn't bode well. It looks like it's 2-player though, so that's nice, and it also seems like you can choose a single event to play, and that was always a slight annoyance with the arcade version. Into the game now then, and the player sprites look pretty reasonable. There's plenty of frames of animation, and it looks like actual sprinting rather than fast walking. Total absence of music and sound though, apart from those nondescript bongs at the start of the race to indicate mark, set, go. No parallax scrolling either, which is a bit of a blow, and I'm pretty sure the CPC wouldn't have any problems doing that, so it's going to lose points here. The running isn't great, it doesn't seem to reward consistency in the joystick waggling, and it just has a bit too much randomness to it. The long jump is here, but it's pretty bare bones. There's no meter markings behind the pit, there's no umpire to measure your jump, and I'm pretty sure the foul mechanism is fairly broken. I mean, that was a good jump, really? Also, the length of the jump visually compared to the distance is completely off. It's very unsatisfying. Javelin's much the same, although it appears you're throwing the javelin on the same piece of track you did the 100-metre sprint on, so it's kind of lazy reusing of assets there. The hurdles isn't too bad, they're evenly spaced and they don't feel too cramped, although as you can see the collision detection probably leaves a little bit to be desired. And there's still no meaningful sound at this point either. The hammer throw is fairly decent, or at least in the mechanics of the throw. It's more forgiving than the arcade version, which is fine. But unforgivably, you can throw the hammer before even starting to spin. So if you press the fire button to start spinning, this is what's going to happen. The zoomed out display of the throw is pretty poor. I mean, wow, look how little detail there is there. The high jump is truly awful though. The angles, the animations, the flickery sprite, the way the player seemingly lands in front of the pad, it's not great. So overall, I mean, this isn't a good conversion really. The mechanics are all there, but the presentation is appalling. It looks like a conversion that was kind of done to a price or an unrealistic deadline. Although it came out in 1988, so my suspicion it was a cash grab to coincide with the 1988 Summer Olympics, but I could be wrong. Anyway, score-wise, 2 out of 5 for graphics. The sprites are nice, but the lazy backgrounds and lack of key visual features and effects is fairly unforgivable. The CPC could have done much better than this. 1 out of 5 for sound, because there really is none. Again, it's lazy. 4 out of 5 for completeness, because all the events are here and they're pretty much complete, at least in the mechanics of them. And finally, 2 out of 5 for playability. The reason for that is the running just doesn't feel nice. The high jump is a bit of a joke, and something about it just feels off. So track and field on the Amstrad CPC gets a rather poor 9 out of 20, and it'll be a cold day in hell before I revisit this one. So given the alphabetical order, the Commodore 64 is next, and I expect this to be a bit different because it was released much earlier, and I think with Konami's involvement. It's got a nice title screen, or at least when compared to the CPC version we just saw, although it's using the stock font though, which is a real bugbear of mine. Into the sprint now, and it's already a world of difference. We've got fairly nice sprites, similar to the CPC, but the background is moving in parallax, so it actually feels fast. The action of running here feels a lot better too. It's more responsive to consistency, and it's not as frustrating as the CPC version. The stock C64 font is still here though, which removes a lot of the feeling of polish. The long jump now, and this is much better. It feels fast on the run up, and the jump feels much more realistic in terms of distance. It's nice to see the meter marker behind the pit, although there's still no umpire doing his little measuring. There's a celebratory animation from the player too, which is notably absent from the CPC version. The javelin feels nice, there's a good sense of speed like the long jump, and the distance feels nice and far. I think the parallax definitely helps out here. The hurdles next, and it's relatively good here too, although the hurdles feel like they are just a bit too close together relative to the speed of the player. Seems like you're barely taking one step between hurdles. It's okay, but it's not great. And the hammer throw feels pretty much like the arcade, so there's no complaints here. It's visually pretty good. It's going to get marked down for the ridiculous crowd size though. I mean, look at it. Some of those folks are about 5 meters wide. Bit of laziness here. And last up we got the high jump. It's much better than the CPC version for sure, but still nowhere near as precise feeling as the arcade. I think the lack of an angle indicator next to the player makes it feel pretty sloppy to play. So overall, this is pretty decent. There's still many corners cut in terms of gameplay and visuals though, and the C64 could do better than this. So score-wise? 4 out of 5 for graphics. Given the C64's weird palette, I think this looks as reasonable as you can expect, but a point off for the lazy use of the system font though. I absolutely hate that. 4 out of 5 for sound, given that everything is here, except the speech from the original, I guess. It's not groundbreaking, but it's almost as good as the arcade. 4 out of 5 for completeness. Like the CPC, all the events are here, but it's missing just a few finishing touches. And finally a 4 out of 5 for playability, because it feels very much like the arcade version, but the high jump really lets it down. So a total of 16 out of 20 for the C64 version, which is quite respectable. And I think I'd been happy with this conversion if I'd shelled out for it as a kid, and that's really enough for me. So finally we get to the Speccy, and the title screen looks awful, just like the CPC, but somehow with even less colour. It looks like you can choose the individual events there, so that's something. The 100-metre sprint feels much like the Amstrad version though. You have to work too much to find the sweet spot when waggling the joystick, and it's frustrating to maintain. Really bare-bone graphics too, it's very lazy. And the long jump is somehow even worse than the CPC version. It's mostly the same, but the pit has absolutely zero colour and the jumps look even shorter. The javelin isn't too bad, but the javelin itself flies way too fast for any kind of exciting climax. Also, the foul mechanic seems to be pretty broken here as well. The 100-metre hurdles is a little better here though. The spacing feels better and the player doesn't jump through the hurdle like the CPC version, so that's something. The hammer though is a real horrible flickery mess. The thrower spins too fast. There's no indicator of the sweet spot like the other versions, and the less said about this wide view the better, I think. I think ironically the high jump is actually the low point of this version. It's a flickery mess, and the jump itself, I mean, look at the jump, it looks utterly ridiculous. So in summary, this is very poor. I mean, the spectrum may be lacking in a few areas compared to the other systems, but there's no excuse for this tripe. It was built to a price and with absolutely no care and attention. So score-wise, I think 1 out of 5 for graphics. It's truly awful. It's not representative of what this system could do. 1 out of 5 for sound as well. Like the CPC, there really isn't any, and that's unforgivable. 4 out of 5 for completeness though, since all the events are here, so that's something. And finally, 2 out of 5 for playability. It's not horrible to play, I wouldn't say, but with everything else being so subpar, the experience just isn't fun. So the Speccy gets the lowest score from me. It's a paltry 8 out of 20, and I feel like I've been generous here. This really is the embodiment of the phrase lazy port, and the developers have done the absolute bare minimum required to get this game shipped. So next up we got 1942, a Second World War themed shooter developed by Capcom in 1984. I was kind of surprised to see it on this list. I mean, I've never considered it to be particularly unique or groundbreaking, but here we are. It's a fairly typical shooter of the era with lots of enemies, varied attack waves and a handful of power-ups to grab. Most notably the power-up that gives you a couple of wingmen, which gives you a larger firing range and also a couple of sacrificial lambs to use. You can perform a vertical loop-the-loop if things get a bit too hectic, and during this manoeuvre you can't be hit. You start off with 3 of these and they're replenished as you progress further through the levels. It's nice to look at, but I don't consider it to be anything special, although I'm not a shoot-'em-up connoisseur, so what do I know really? We'll start with the Amstrad CPC version again like last time, and honestly I actually quite like this one. All the mechanics from the original are here, including the vertical loop, and it's not at all bad to look at. Whilst it probably looks unbearably slow, you don't really feel it that much while playing the game, and the low frame rate doesn't really impact your ability to play it well. It's more responsive than it looks, and the difficulty level is probably just about right, if perhaps a tiny bit on the easy side, but that's okay. It does have one fairly annoying issue though, and that's on these later levels where you're flying over land. It's very difficult to see what's going on due to the mixture of similar colours. I got taken out by a stray bullet that I couldn't see more times than I'd care to count. I consider this a bit of a developer oversight rather than a failing of the CPC though, because there's a number of ways they could have done this differently. So score-wise, I'd say 3 out of 5 for graphics. Lots of varied colours of enemies, the sprites are nicely animated, but the game has to lose marks for that horrible colour clash issue. 4 out of 5 for sound. The title music is nice and the in-game effects are functional, let's say. 5 out of 5 for completeness on this one, because as far as I can tell everything that matters is here, and that's really all you can ask for. And finally 3 out of 5 for playability. It feels great to play, but the graphical colour clash also affects the playability, so I can't really give it more than 3 here. So 1942 on the CPC gets a pretty respectable 15 out of 20, and it's an excellent conversion in my book. It's marred only by that colour clash issue. So next up we got the C64, and you can immediately tell this is going to be a solid conversion. The title screen's nice, with the colour cycling high score table and a great soundtrack. Into the game and the visuals are great. You've got nicely defined varied sprites with good use of the C64's palette. Like the CPC, all the mechanics of the game are here, and unlike the CPC, there's no colour clashing issue. It also moves at a lovely fast frame rate too. The sound is annoying though, because it does the one thing that I hate in older games. It's got music during play, but it cuts out one channel when sound effects are needed. I hated this back in the day, and I still hate it now. I mean, remove either the music or the sound effects, but don't leave this halfway situation because it's really frustrating to listen to. The Xenon 2 on the Amiga is the absolute worst example of this, in case you needed a reference. However, all that aside, there is a huge issue with this conversion, and I'm sure I'll get a ton of flack for saying this, but it's way too hard. I know arcade games are supposed to be hard, but this takes it to the extreme. Bullets fly way too fast, planes come from behind you, resulting in cheap deaths, and this conversion seems to put you back much further than the others when you die. Ultimately, this game snatches defeat from the jaws of victory for me, and it could have been perfect. So score-wise, 5 out of 5 for graphics in my book. I'm not sure what more they could have done, really. 3 out of 5 for sound. It's got nice music, decent sound effects, but for God's sake, pick one or the other. 5 out of 5 for completeness, just like the CPC. It's all here, everything is here. And finally, and I'll duck for cover and apologise profusely as I say this, but it's only getting 1 out of 5 for playability. It's too hard. It's not just a challenge, it's way too hard. It completely ruins it for me. So a total of 14 out of 20 for 1942 on the C64, and this has shown me my scoring system probably doesn't work that well. The difficulty is game breaking, so it's not one I'll ever revisit. And last up, of course, is the ZX Spectrum. And first thing I note is a lack of music on the title screen, which is a shame because this is really the only opportunity they would have had for music. Into the game itself, and well, this isn't too shabby at all. It moves around pretty quickly, there's plenty of enemies. I'm kind of glad they skipped the music as well, since it probably wouldn't have worked here. The sound effects are pretty basic, but they're totally functional. There's a bullet sound, there's a death sound, and there's a cute little 7-note phrase each time the game starts. Kind of sounds like a musical sting from a commercial for a trendy lifestyle brand or something like that. Where it all comes unstuck, just like the CPC, but worse, I would say, is the colour clash once you get over land. And look, I totally get this issue as part of the Speccy's DNA, but it might have been better just to not bother with these sections at all and just admit defeat. Enemy bullets are almost impossible to track over land. I found myself getting killed by a stray bullet that I didn't see more times than I'd care to count. That aside though, it does have all the arcade power-ups and features, and the difficulty level is probably just about right, and it feels nice to play, which really is the main thing. So score-wise, I'd say 3 out of 5 for graphics, and that's only given that the colour clash issue does actually affect the gameplay. It gets a 2 out of 5 for sound, because what's here is fine, it's just there isn't much of it. 5 out of 5 for completeness, just like the other versions, because everything is here, certainly at least in terms of gameplay. And like the CPC, 3 out of 5 for playability. It feels great until you get over land, and then it's just game over. So a total of 13 out of 20 for the ZX Spectrum. What's interesting is that it's clearly broken my scoring system, since I'd play this or the CPC version over the C64 version any day of the week. But it is what it is. Let's be honest, you had no clue who Iron Man Stuart was before you played this game, right? Yeah, nor me. This is Man Stuart Super Off-Road, developed for the arcades in 1989 by Leland Corporation. It's a fairly straight-up racer in the mould of Super Sprint or Indy Heat. You race around a supposed 4x4 track against 3 opponents, collecting monetary power-ups and nitros in a race to the finish. Finishing in anything other than first place will cost you a credit. In between races, you can spend your hard-earned gains on engine, suspension, handling and acceleration upgrades, as well as purchasing nitro boosts. These nitro boosts give you a quick and short burst of speed during the race with the press of a button, and you can use them as frequently as you'd like. This isn't my favourite arcade racer by any stretch though. In fact, it's not even my favourite top-down single-screen racer, but it is hectic and it's quite the challenge. That said, I own the C64 version of this, and I played it reasonably regularly as a young'un, so it'll be interesting to revisit. So straight into the CPC version, and it's got a nice title screen. The title music is pretty nice too, and given the system's limitations at least. I'm not sure why the title screen is so plain and it just says Iron Man though. Into the first race then, and damn. So it's got the same music as the title screen, and that's a bit of a drag. The racing itself doesn't feel too bad though. I mean, it's certainly slowing down when the action gets a little busy, as you can probably see, and it drags down the music with it. On the subject of which, why is it so out of tune? It's very odd. The winning screen and the in-between shop screen is pretty basic looking, but all the upgrades are here, which is nice. The second track is interesting though. Why is the water black? I think I might be experiencing my first dose of lazy Spectrum port here, although I can't be 100% sure. There's two trucks the same colour, which is interesting. It's not a deal breaker, but I wonder why these weird colour deficiencies are here on the system with supposedly the better palette. The developers on this conversion did a good job of recreating the driving feel of the arcade version though, and it plays really nicely. Until you hit a wall, that is. It has a habit of bouncing you back in the exact opposite direction to the way you're facing, even after a minor graze on a wall, and it's a real pain in the ass to turn back round. It made playing this version really stressful. You can be way out in front, but one slightly misplaced manoeuvre and you're facing backwards, so you're constantly on edge. It's not a nice feeling. The opponent cars seem to get in a muddle at least once a race too, such that you hear the sound of them crashing into each other like 25 times a second till they free themselves up, usually at your expense. So anyway, score-wise, I think 2 out of 5 for graphics, because something isn't right here. I think this conversion has lazy speccy-itis. I could be wrong though. 2 out of 5 for sound. It's not bad, but it's not great, and the same track for every level is almost probably worse than having no music. 4 out of 5 for completeness. It's got 2-player mode and all the tracks are here. And lastly, 2 out of 5 for playability. The game kicks ass right until you come a cropper, and then it just unfairly punishes you almost every time. So 11 out of 20 for the CPC conversion. I think it's fair since it's really an unremarkable one, and I don't think I'd go back to it. Heading over to the C64 now, and it's got a nice title screen just like the CPC. You can instantly tell more effort's gone into the incidental screens on this version though, and not because the C64 is more capable, but there's just more care and attention taken here. Into the first race, and thank God we got some different music. All 4 vehicles are here and they're the correct colour. Nice to see the turbo sound doesn't cut off the music either, which, like I said in the 1942 comparison, it really grinds my gears when that happens. The second track has the bluegrass sounding music score, which is my favourite from the arcade, so that's nice to see. It has a bit of variety, and this fast-paced soundtrack complements the action perfectly. As for the driving itself, it's pretty solid, although the CPC version is better, at least up to the point that you hit an obstacle of course, since the C64 version is much more forgiving. I didn't find myself facing the wrong way anywhere near as much as the CPC. That said, the collision detection can easily lose you a race though in this one, like here with this invisible force field I'm having to negotiate. Overall though, more care has gone into this version, it absolutely shows. It's more of a complete experience. So score-wise, I'd say 4 out of 5 for graphics. It looks great, but somehow the various sprite animations are clumsier than the CPC version. 5 out of 5 for sound, because I'm not sure what more they could have done in this department. 4 out of 5 for completeness. Like the CPC, it's got 2-player mode, it has all the tracks, but the incidental screens are lacking quite a lot of the graphics of the arcade version. And finally, 2 out of 5 for playability. It's better than the CPC, and worse at the same time. It's more forgiving on collisions, but it constantly has you hitting invisible objects. So a fairly respectable 15 out of 20 for the C64, and I could see myself revisiting this one. And last up, it'll come as no surprise we got the Spectrum version. There's a complete absence of sound on the title screen, although it turns up once you've selected a control method. So no music in the game, and wow. Okay, all the cars are the same colour, so this is going to be interesting. It looks like the player vehicle has a little block just above it to indicate which one it is. Or maybe it's supposed to be a flag, I'm not sure. This one looks so much like the CPC version that I think my guess of lazy Speccy conversion wasn't far wide of the mark. That said, it's not exactly the same, because I like the way this one plays. In normal driving it feels tight and under your control just like the CPC version, but it doesn't seem to turn you 180 degrees if an opponent simply glances in your direction. It does have one hideous feature though, which is the name of the power-up you just collected is non-transparent, so if you're taking a corner or a particularly tricky piece of track when collecting something, you can't see for a brief moment. It's very annoying and it actually cost me a couple of times. Probably the most amusing part, or to me at least, is that the water in this version is actually blue. It's very odd. As far as I can tell, the tracks are pixel identical to the CPC version, with the exception of the colour palette, so make of that what you will. Above all though, I actually like this version. I think of the three, this one actually plays the best, which just goes to show what you can achieve if you focus on gameplay. So score-wise, I'd say 4 out of 5 for graphics here. There's nothing wrong with what they've done, and it plays to the Speccy strengths quite well. 3 out of 5 for sound. I mean, there's not much here, but I wouldn't expect music during play on this system. And in actual fact, I think the CPC version would have been better off dropping the music altogether, given that they only had one soundtrack. 4 out of 5 for completeness, again because everything is here, except some of the winning podium graphics just like the other versions, and I think they could have been included. And finally 4 out of 5 for playability. The reason for that, it seems to have the best bits of the CPC and C64 versions mashed together. I definitely enjoyed playing this one the most, and that might be a surprise to you, but it's the truth. So a total of 15 out of 20 for the Spectrum, and despite it being the same score as the C64, I think this is the better playing of the two. Anyway, that's going to have to be it for part 1, because this video's already gone on way longer than I expected it to. If you enjoyed watching part 1 of this series, I'd really appreciate it if you could like the video, maybe even subscribe. It'll make me feel warm and fuzzy, and it will certainly let me know that people are watching what I'm doing. It'll also encourage me to make more videos, so please hit the button if you can. Anyway, I'll see you in part 2.